the new god of anointing, the new gods of anointing, the new god of anointing, the new goddess of anointing, the new goddesses of anointing, the new goddess of anointing, the old god of anointing, the old gods of anointing, the old god of anointing, the old goddess of anointing, the old goddesses of anointing, the old goddess of anointing, the greater god of anointing, the greater gods of anointing, the greater god of anointing, the greater goddess of anointing, the greater goddesses of anointing, the greater goddess of anointing, the lesser god of anointing, the lesser gods of anointing, the lesser god of anointing, the lesser goddess of anointing, the lesser goddesses of anointing, the lesser goddess of anointing, the higher god of anointing, the higher gods of anointing, the higher god of anointing, the higher goddess of anointing, the higher goddesses of anointing, the higher goddess of anointing, the lower god of anointing, the lower gods of anointing, the lower god of anointing, the lower goddess of anointing, the lower goddesses of anointing, the lower goddess of anointing, the greater spirit of anointing, the greater spirits of anointing, the greater spirit of anointing, the lesser spirit of anointing, the lesser spirits of anointing, the lesser spirit of anointing, the higher spirit of anointing, the higher spirits of anointing, the higher spirit of anointing, the lower spirit of anointing, the lower spirits of anointing, the lower spirit of anointing, the major god of anointing, the major gods of anointing, the major god of anointing, the major goddess of anointing, the major goddesses of anointing, the major goddess of anointing, the minor god of anointing, the minor gods of anointing, the minor god of anointing, the minor goddess of anointing, the minor goddesses of anointing, the minor goddess of anointing, the superior god of anointing, the superior gods of anointing, the superior god of anointing, the superior goddess of anointing, the superior goddesses of anointing, the superior goddess of anointing, the inferior god of anointing, the inferior gods of anointing, the inferior god of anointing, the inferior goddess of anointing, the inferior goddesses of anointing, the inferior goddess of anointing, the ancestor god of anointing, the ancestor gods of anointing, the ancestor god of anointing, the ancestor goddess of anointing, the ancestor goddesses of anointing, the ancestor goddess of anointing, the ascendant god of anointing, the ascendant gods of anointing, the ascendant god of anointing, the ascendant goddess of anointing, the ascendant goddesses of anointing, the ascendant goddess of anointing, the descendant god of anointing, the descendant gods of anointing, the descendant god of anointing, the descendant goddess of anointing, the descendant goddesses of anointing, the descendant goddess of anointing, the transcendent god of anointing, the transcendent gods of anointing, the transcendent god of anointing, the transcendent goddess of anointing, the transcendent goddesses of anointing, the transcendent goddess of anointing, the past god of anointing, the past gods of anointing, the past god of anointing, the past goddess of anointing, the past goddesses of anointing, the past goddess of anointing Q, the present god of anointing, the present gods of anointing, the present god of anointing, the present goddess of anointing, the present goddesses of anointing, the present goddess of anointing, the future god of anointing, the future gods of anointing, the future god of anointing, the future goddess of anointing, the future goddesses of anointing, the future goddess of anointing, the authentic god of anointing, the authentic gods of anointing, the authentic god of anointing, the authentic goddess of anointing, the authentic goddesses of anointing, the authentic goddess of anointing, the synthetic god of anointing, the synthetic gods of anointing, the synthetic god of anointing, the synthetic goddess of anointing, the synthetic goddesses of anointing, the synthetic goddess of anointing, the progressive god of anointing, the progressive gods of anointing, the progressive god of anointing, The progressive goddess of anointing. The progressive goddesses of anointing. The progressive goddess of anointing. The regressive god of anointing. The regressive gods of anointing. The regressive god of anointing. The regressive goddess of anointing. The regressive goddesses of anointing. The regressive goddess of anointing. The ordinary god of anointing. The ordinary gods of anointing. The ordinary god of anointing. The ordinary goddess of anointing. The ordinary goddesses of anointing. The ordinary goddess of anointing. The extraordinary god of anointing. The extraordinary gods of anointing. The extraordinary god of anointing. The extraordinary goddess of anointing. The extraordinary goddesses of anointing. The extraordinary goddess of anointing. The static god of anointing. The static gods of anointing. The static god of anointing. The static goddess of anointing. The static goddesses of anointing. The static goddess of anointing. The dynamic god of anointing. The dynamic gods of anointing. The dynamic god of anointing. The dynamic goddess of anointing. The dynamic goddesses of anointing. The dynamic goddess of anointing. The land god of anointing. The land gods of anointing. The land god of anointing. The land goddess of anointing. The land goddesses of anointing. The land goddess of anointing. The sea god of anointing. The sea gods of anointing. The sea god of anointing. The sea goddess of anointing. The sea goddesses of anointing. The sea goddess of anointing. The sky god of anointing. The sky gods of anointing. The sky god of anointing. The sky goddess of anointing. The sky goddesses of anointing. The sky goddess of anointing. The god of anointing. The gods of anointing. The god of anointing. The goddess of anointing. The goddesses of anointing. The goddess of anointing. The half god of anointing. The half gods of anointing. The half god of anointing. The half goddess of anointing. The half goddesses of anointing. The half goddess of anointing. The vessel of anointing. The vessels of anointing. The vessel of anointing. The name of anointing. The names of anointing. The name of anointing. The person of anointing. The persons of anointing. The person of anointing. The persona of anointing. The personas of anointing. The persona of anointing. The personage of anointing. The personages of anointing. The personage of anointing. The personality of anointing. The personalities of anointing. The personality of anointing. The personification of anointing. The personifications of anointing. The personification of anointing. The image of anointing. The images of anointing. The image of anointing. The imagination of anointing. The imaginations of anointing. The imagination of anointing. The belief of anointing. The beliefs of anointing. The belief of anointing. The thought of anointing. The thoughts of anointing. The thought of anointing. The word of anointing. The words of anointing. The word of anointing. The action of anointing. The actions of anointing. The action of anointing. The reaction of anointing. The reactions of anointing. The reaction of anointing. The feeling of anointing. The feelings of anointing. The feeling of anointing. The situation of anointing. The situations of anointing. The situation of anointing. The circumstance of anointing. The circumstances of anointing. The circumstance of anointing. The environment of anointing. The environments of anointing. The environment of anointing. The relationship of anointing. The relationships of anointing. The relationship of anointing. The number of anointing. The numbers of anointing. The number of anointing. The formula of anointing. The formulas of anointing. The formula of anointing. The equation of anointing. The equations of anointing. The equation of anointing. The theory of anointing. The theories of anointing. The theory of anointing. The symbol of anointing. The symbols of anointing. The symbol of anointing. The color of anointing. The colors of anointing. The color of anointing. The thing of anointing. The things of anointing. The thing of anointing. The way of anointing. The ways of anointing. The way of anointing. The place of anointing. The places of anointing. The place of anointing. The time of anointing. The times of anointing. The time of anointing. The event of anointing. The events of anointing. The event of anointing. The result of anointing. The results of anointing. The result of anointing. The crown of anointing. The crowns of anointing. The crown of anointing. The throne of anointing. The thrones of anointing. The throne of anointing. The anointing king. The anointing kings. The anointing kingdom. The anointing kingdoms. The anointing king's subject. The anointing king's subjects. The anointing king's dominion. The anointing king's dominions. The kingdom of anointing. The kingdoms of anointing. The kingdom of anointing. The anointing queen. The anointing queens. The anointing queendom. The anointing queendoms. The anointing queen's subject. The anointing queen's subjects. The anointing queen's dominion. The anointing queen's dominions. The queendom of anointing. The queendoms of anointing. The queendom of anointing. The anointing prince. The anointing princes. The anointing princedom. The anointing princedoms. The anointing prince's subject. The anointing prince's subjects. The anointing prince's dominion. The anointing prince's dominions. The princedom of anointing. The princedoms of anointing. The princedom of anointing. The anointing princess. The anointing princesses. The anointing princessdom. The anointing princessdoms. The anointing princess's subject. The anointing princess's subjects. The anointing princess's dominion. The anointing princess's dominions. The princessdom of anointing. The princessdoms of anointing. The princessdom of anointing. The Lord of anointing. The lords of anointing. The Lord of anointing. The lordess of anointing. The lordesses of anointing. The lordess of anointing. The priest of anointing. The priests of anointing. The priest of anointing. The priestess of anointing. The priestesses of anointing. The priestess of anointing. The ritual of anointing. The rituals of anointing. The ritual of anointing. The shrine of anointing. The shrines of anointing. The shrine of anointing. The temple of anointing. The temples of anointing. The temple of anointing. The leader of anointing. The leaders of anointing. The leader of anointing. The follower of anointing. The followers of anointing. The follower of anointing. The natural substance of anointing. The natural substances of anointing. The natural substance of anointing. The supernatural substance of anointing. The supernatural substances of anointing. The supernatural substance of anointing. The temporal substance of anointing. The temporal substances of anointing. The temporal substance of anointing. The spiritual substance of anointing. The spiritual substances of anointing. The spiritual substance of anointing. The natural form of anointing. The natural forms of anointing. The natural form of anointing. The supernatural form of anointing. The supernatural forms of anointing. The supernatural form of anointing. The temporal form of anointing. The temporal forms of anointing. The temporal form of anointing. The spiritual form of anointing. The spiritual forms of anointing. The spiritual form of anointing. The age of anointing. The ages of anointing. The age of anointing. The era of anointing. The heiress of anointing. The era of anointing. The awakener of anointing. The awakeners of anointing. The awakener of anointing. The awakening of anointing. The awakenings of anointing. The awakening of anointing. The realm of anointing. The realms of anointing. The realm of anointing. The dimension of anointing. The dimensions of anointing. The dimension of anointing. The zone of anointing. The zones of anointing. The zone of anointing. The frequency of anointing. The frequencies of anointing. The frequency of anointing. The century of anointing. The centuries of anointing. The century of anointing. The millennium of anointing. The millenniums of anointing. The millennium of anointing. The purpose of anointing. The purposes of anointing. The purpose of anointing. The meaning of anointing. The meanings of anointing. The meaning of anointing. The culture of anointing. The cultures of anointing. The culture of anointing. The demonstrator of anointing. The demonstrators of anointing. The demonstrator of anointing. The demonstration of anointing. The demonstrations of anointing. The demonstration of anointing. The manifester of anointing. The manifestors of anointing. The manifester of anointing. The manifestation of anointing. The manifestations of anointing. The manifestation of anointing. The presence of anointing. The presences of anointing. The presence of anointing. The glow of anointing. The glows of anointing. The glow of anointing. The goal of anointing. The goals of anointing. The goal of anointing. The plan of anointing. The plans of anointing. The plan of anointing. The book of anointing. The books of anointing. The book of anointing. The philosopher of anointing. The philosophers of anointing. The philosopher of anointing. The philosophy of anointing. The philosophies of anointing. The philosophy of anointing. The releaser of anointing. The releasers of anointing. The releaser of anointing. The release of anointing. The releases of anointing. The release of anointing. The variable of anointing. The variables of anointing. The variable of anointing. The cause of anointing. The causes of anointing. The cause of anointing. The effect of anointing. The effects of anointing. The effect of anointing. The journey of anointing. The journeys of anointing. The journey of anointing. The emergence of anointing. The emergences of anointing. The emergence of anointing. The source of anointing. The sources of anointing. The source of anointing. The originator of anointing. The originators of anointing. The originator of anointing. The origin of anointing. The origins of anointing. The origin of anointing. The forefather of anointing. The forefathers of anointing. The forefather of anointing. The foremother of anointing. The foremothers of anointing. The foremother of anointing. The ancestor of anointing. The ancestors of anointing. The ancestor of anointing. The descendant of anointing. The descendants of anointing. The descendant of anointing. The lineage of anointing. The lineages of anointing. The lineage of anointing. The heritage of anointing. The heritages of anointing. The heritage of anointing. The heir of anointing. The heirs of anointing. The heir of anointing. The co-heir of anointing. The co-heirs of anointing. The co-heir of anointing. The joint heir of anointing. The joint heirs of anointing. The joint heir of anointing. The dynasty of anointing. The dynasties of anointing. The dynasty of anointing. The force of anointing. The forces of anointing. The force of anointing. The law of anointing. The laws of anointing. The law of anointing. The pact of anointing. The pacts of anointing. The pact of anointing. The game of anointing. The games of anointing. The game of anointing. The mask of anointing. The masks of anointing. The mask of anointing. The armor of anointing. The armors of anointing. The armor of anointing. The sword of anointing. The swords of anointing. The sword of anointing. The shield of anointing. The shields of anointing. The shield of anointing. The force shield of anointing. The force shields of anointing. The force shield of anointing. The armored force shield of anointing. The armored force shields of anointing. The armored force shield of anointing. The champion of anointing. The champions of anointing. The champion of anointing. The guardian of anointing. The guardians of anointing. The guardian of anointing. The defender of anointing. The defenders of anointing. The defender of anointing. The protector of anointing. The protectors of anointing. The protector of anointing. The chant of anointing. The chants of anointing. The chant of anointing. The shape of anointing. The shapes of anointing. The shape of anointing. The cube of anointing. The cubes of anointing. The cube of anointing. The cuboid of anointing. The cuboids of anointing. The cuboid of anointing. The sphere of anointing. The spheres of anointing. The sphere of anointing. The spheroid of anointing. The spheroids of anointing. The spheroid of anointing. The prism of anointing. The prisms of anointing. The prism of anointing. The pyramid of anointing. The pyramids of anointing. The pyramid of anointing. The cylinder of anointing. The cylinders of anointing. The cylinder of anointing. The cone of anointing. The cones of anointing. The cone of anointing. The triangle of anointing. The triangles of anointing. The triangle of anointing. The circle of anointing. The circles of anointing. The circle of anointing. The semicircle of anointing. The semicircles of anointing. The semicircle of anointing. The square of anointing. The squares of anointing. The square of anointing. The rectangle of anointing. The rectangles of anointing. The rectangle of anointing. The parallelogram of anointing. The parallelograms of anointing. The parallelogram of anointing. The rhombus of anointing. The rhombuses of anointing. The rhombus of anointing. The trapezoid of anointing. The trapezoids of anointing. The trapezoid of anointing. The polygon of anointing. The polygons of anointing. The polygon of anointing. The pentagon of anointing. The pentagons of anointing. The pentagon of anointing. The hexagon of anointing. The hexagons of anointing. The hexagon of anointing. The septagon of anointing. The septagons of anointing. The septagon of anointing. The octagon of anointing. The octagons of anointing. The octagon of anointing. The nonagon of anointing. The nonagons of anointing. The nonagon of anointing. The decagon of anointing. The decagons of anointing. The decagon of anointing. The evolution of anointing. The evolutions of anointing. The evolution of anointing. The revolution of anointing. The revolutions of anointing. The revolution of anointing. The elemental art of anointing. The elemental arts of anointing. The elemental art of anointing. The elemental science of anointing. The elemental sciences of anointing. The elemental science of anointing. The elemental principle of anointing. The elemental principles of anointing. The elemental principle of anointing. The elemental technology of anointing. The elemental technologies of anointing. The elemental technology of anointing. The low elemental art of anointing. The low elemental arts of anointing. The low elemental art of anointing. The low elemental science of anointing. The low elemental sciences of anointing. The low elemental science of anointing. The low elemental principle of anointing. The low elemental principles of anointing. The low elemental principle of anointing. The low elemental technology of anointing. The low elemental technologies of anointing. The low elemental technology of anointing. The high elemental art of anointing. The high elemental arts of anointing. The high elemental art of anointing. The high elemental science of anointing. The high elemental sciences of anointing. The high elemental science of anointing. The high elemental principle of anointing. The high elemental principles of anointing. The high elemental principle of anointing. The high elemental technology of anointing. The high elemental technologies of anointing. The high elemental technology of anointing. The agent of anointing. The agents of anointing. The agent of anointing. The agency of anointing. The agencies of anointing. The agency of anointing. The amplifier of anointing. The amplifiers of anointing. The amplifier of anointing. The amplification of anointing. The amplifications of anointing. The amplification of anointing. The enhancer of anointing. The enhancers of anointing. The enhancer of anointing. The enhancement of anointing. The enhancements of anointing. The enhancement of anointing. The magnifier of anointing. The magnifiers of anointing. The magnifier of anointing. The magnification of anointing. The magnifications of anointing. The magnification of anointing. The influencer of anointing. The influencers of anointing. The influencer of anointing. The influence of anointing. The influences of anointing. The influence of anointing. The emanator of anointing. The emanators of anointing. The emanator of anointing. The emanation of anointing. The emanations of anointing. The emanation of anointing. The converger of anointing. The convergers of anointing. The converger of anointing. The convergence of anointing. The convergences of anointing. The convergence of anointing. The aura of anointing. The auras of anointing. The aura of anointing. The impression of anointing. The impressions of anointing. The impression of anointing. The intelligence of anointing. The intelligences of anointing. The intelligence of anointing. The sophistication of anointing. The sophistications of anointing. The sophistication of anointing. The genius of anointing. The geniuses of anointing. The genius of anointing. The polymath of anointing. The polymaths of anointing. The polymath of anointing. The psychic of anointing. The psychics of anointing. The psychic of anointing. The knowledge of anointing. The knowledges of anointing. The knowledge of anointing. The understanding of anointing. The understandings of anointing. The understanding of anointing. The wisdom of anointing. The wisdoms of anointing. The wisdom of anointing. The secret of anointing. The secrets of anointing. The secret of anointing. The mystery of anointing. The mysteries of anointing. The mystery of anointing. The revelation of anointing. The revelations of anointing. The revelation of anointing. The tactic of anointing. The tactics of anointing. The tactic of anointing. The strategy of anointing. The strategies of anointing. The strategy of anointing. The strength of anointing. The strengths of anointing. The strength of anointing. The might of anointing. The mights of anointing. The might of anointing. The power of anointing. The powers of anointing. The power of anointing. The authority of anointing. The authorities of anointing. The authority of anointing. The dominion of anointing. The dominions of anointing. The dominion of anointing. The rhythm of anointing. The rhythms of anointing. The rhythm of anointing. The melody of anointing. The melodies of anointing. The melody of anointing. The music of anointing. The musics of anointing. The music of anointing. The lyric of anointing. The lyrics of anointing. The lyric of anointing. The song of anointing. The songs of anointing. The song of anointing. The dance of anointing. The dances of anointing. The dance of anointing. The spirit of anointing. The spirits of anointing. The spirit of anointing. The soul of anointing. The souls of anointing. The soul of anointing. The body of anointing. The bodies of anointing. The body of anointing. The mark of anointing. The marks of anointing. The mark of anointing. The promise of anointing. The promises of anointing. The promise of anointing. The visionary of anointing. The visionaries of anointing. The visionary of anointing. The vision of anointing. The visions of anointing. The vision of anointing. The picture of anointing. The pictures of anointing. The picture of anointing. The sound of anointing. The sounds of anointing. The sound of anointing. The dung of anointing. The dungs of anointing. The dung of anointing. The language of anointing. The languages of anointing. The language of anointing. The communication of anointing. The communications of anointing. The communication of anointing. The people of anointing. The peoples of anointing. The people of anointing. The society of anointing. The societies of anointing. The society of anointing. The fortress of anointing. The fortresses of anointing. The fortress of anointing. The government of anointing. The governments of anointing. The government of anointing. The city of anointing. The cities of anointing. The city of anointing. The nation of anointing. The nations of anointing. The nation of anointing. The civilization of anointing. The civilizations of anointing. The civilization of anointing. The world of anointing. The worlds of anointing. The world of anointing.